Hi, I'm Mike Devlin, and this is where we open the door to family law. In this first episode of the series, we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of family law. We're going to explore what it means to be involved in the family justice system. And today, I'm going to be talking to Andy McIntyre, who's a former client of mine, and we first met nearly 15 years ago, and since his case finished, we've stayed in touch from time to time. Andy, thank you very much indeed for coming along as a guest to the podcast. I'd like to just tell you a little bit about Andy. When we first met, he told me that he had been a journalist, a sports journalist, I think concentrating on football for the Sunday People at one time, before then moving into business where he worked with Jacqueline Gold in her business. But since we met, Andy has moved on to a variety of different things. And now he's the co-founder and chair of VSI Executive Education, preparing sports people and business people for an executive role in sports management, particularly in football. So Andy's had a very varied career and is now quite a high-profile guy in the sports management field and is based at MMU. Andy, what was it that encouraged you to come along and talk about the family justice system and your own experiences?
Mike, you would describe yourself as a client, and I clearly was a client, but you were very much more than a solicitor. You were a confidant, you're an emotional crutch, a guider, a mentor through the most traumatic period of my life. And I can never ever thank you enough. And your name holds great affection in my wider family because they know the part that you played in, without over dramatising it, rescuing my son from a situation where the courts eventually recognised he was in significant physical and mental danger.
Wow. I don't think I'd realised quite the impact that I'd had.
Well, I think it's a bit like you often find that people talk about one particular teacher, for example, in their dark, distant past, who the teacher has no idea just what impact they've had. They've gone to work, and clearly I was a job for you, but the impacts that family law has, and great family law solicitors, and I use the word great advisedly, you really do change people's worlds.
Yeah. Well, speaking of for myself, I never thought of it as a job.
No, I realise that.
It might sound a little bit corny, but I think for me it was more of a vocation, almost a calling, to help people in the worst situation that they could find themselves in. Tell me a little bit about, I've given you an intro, but tell me a little bit about yourself and what you're up to now.
So I'm a dad of two children, principally, and I have had a lifelong passion for sport. I've been a sports journalist, as you identified, and I sold the business that I owned post 2012, and I was in a fortunate position really that I had some money at a time when the money wasn't freely available in the market, so I was able to support a number of small businesses. But I met a character by the name of Tony Faulkner, who worked for Manchester City at the time, performance director at the academy. Very, very impressive individual. And I went to hear him speak one night, and I waited after his speech because I wanted to engage with him because I was impressed by him. And it turned out he lived 5 minutes away from where I lived, and we became great friends. And he had identified a brain drain of talent out of sport, not just football, cricket, rugby, hockey, athletics. And the situation was that because of an athlete is effectively full-time from the age of 15 or 16, they haven't had the normal education opportunities that most people would enjoy. And there was a recognition, particularly among international owners, that they needed more highly skilled people to be running the sports side of their business, particularly the football or cricket or hockey departments, and also the chief executives. They needed people who had better, often bespoke skill sets to sport to run that part of the organisation. And we had identified this, and we created a master's degree for sporting directors, which, as you are correctly identified, we initially ran with MMU, but we've now run incarnations with Salford and UEL. But we also ran an MBA for those who wanted to be chief executives in sport. And I think we've enjoyed significant success. You talked about your position being somewhat vocational. Tony and I definitely see ours as being vocational.
We'll bring the thread back together again, because I think that Tony's involvement wasn't simply to do with business, but it was also to do with your son, who was the reason you came to see me. So let's go back in time to the point when we first met. And if you can just explain how it was that you ended up in the family justice system, and most importantly, how it felt at that time, just at the point that we met.
At the point that we met, I was at a desperate stage in my life. So I had had a brief relationship with a woman, and we'd had a child together. Safe to say that she had a chronic alcohol problem and a history of being fairly violent. And
sadly, she's passed away recently.
Sadly, a few weeks ago, she passed away of alcohol-related illness. So again, desperately tragic. And again, for the record, my feelings are that she was very, very badly let down by the family law system, which is adversarial in my mind, and designed to put people at loggerheads with each other, rather than to bring people together to find a resolution that should be focused on the child.
Just in defence of the system, because I can hear voices being raised in the back of my head. The family justice system describes itself as inquisitorial, in other words, not adversarial, and designed to promote the best interests and the welfare of the child above all else. But you tell me about your
in my experience they're hollow words, and in fact, they're process driven with little human sanity, to be frank with you. So our matter could have been resolved very, very quickly. You asked me about our first engagement, and it was after my son had attended school with when he was 7, with a letter that he'd apparently written with points 1 to 10. Point 1 being, I love my mummy. Point 2 being, my mummy's a yummy mummy. Point 3, my daddy kicks me, punches me, elbows me. Point 4, my daddy sniffs white powder. Point 5, my granny's the wicked witch of the northwest. It went on. Points 1 to 10. Almost like something out of the Sun newspaper. 10 things you didn't know about family law. Most unlike a child would write. So when I came to you, I'd reached a situation where I had felt it necessary to make an application for a residency order against my wishes, because my ideal was that we could share parenting responsibilities. It proved problematic, and 2 weeks before receiving the letter that I've just described, I had attended the home that I'd provided her with, and she didn't know where it was, and she was heavily inebriated. And my brother-in-law found him near the A34, which is the main trunk road into Manchester from the south of Manchester. And reluctantly, I decided that I had to make this application.
Just because I think it's worth going into the detail. His mum didn't know where he was, and your brother-in-law, who he was close to, found him. But where did he find him? Where was he?
He had a den by the A34. He also had another den, it transpired, by what he called the swamp, but it was a pond. So he would spend much of his life as a 6 and 7-year-old wandering a local housing estate, doing his own thing. I now know that he would spend time also helping to clear his mum's vomit, look after her when she was incapable, and quite heartrending stories when I now hear him talk about it as a 20-year-old. And he's not talking about it from a position of negativity, he's talking about it as a matter of fact.
Yeah. So this is the point you came to see me. Was that your first involvement in the family justice system?
No, I'd previously spoken to another lawyer because I had this particular girl had arranged a surprise wedding for me on Christmas Eve, under the threat that if I didn't marry her, I'd never see again. So I sought the counsel of a solicitor. She gave me advice, which would be to do everything within my powers to financially support the individuals, my son and his mother, in the hope that that would encourage her to be flexible in terms of the parenting arrangements. But it was unsuccessful. So if I booked a week's long holiday, she would say, no, you can only go for 5 days. Of course, it's more expensive actually to go for 5 days than it is for a week. And we would have to rock up at court because I'd be paying for it. And I couldn't afford to be paying every time I attended court or wanted to go away on a holiday. So
my memory, Andy, is that before coming to see me, you'd already been involved in quite lengthy proceedings represented by a different
we had
person.
And those proceedings were around contact time and access to it, because his mother's preference was that I didn't have any. So it was established that there were she had residency, and residency, again, I speak as a layperson, but it is something that great attachment is put onto, and in itself is adversarial, because just the use of the language, it's almost empowers one element of the couple.
Yeah. Since you were involved, those terms have changed now,
Have they?
that the court describes child arrangements and the time that a child spends with each parent, but there is still quite often an issue to decide whether a child lives with one parent and spends time with another, or lives with both people. So there's still an area for dispute. But you described how your son had gone into school with a letter. What did he do with that letter? What happened?
Well, he'd been with me on the Sunday, and I recall it very, very clearly. And he'd been in the back of the car. We had friends at the house, and we got out to collect some pizzas on a Sunday afternoon. I was driving, was chatting away to me, but he was telling me he was agitated and disturbed, telling me that he had some things he had to say about me that I wasn't going to be very happy. Oh, yes, things about that he had to say. He didn't say it was about me. Things he had to say that he was unhappy about. And I said, listen, son, as long as you always tell the truth in life, you won't go far wrong. So don't worry about it. Let's enjoy our afternoon. And one of the things that had marked the contact time was that we'd go to absolutely any length not to go back to his mother's house, which should have really set alarm bells ringing. When I say any length, he would scream, he would cry, he would kick, he would hide. You couldn't get him into the car. It was each return to her home was traumatic, and I use that word advisedly. It was traumatic for all concerns, because to see him on one occasion on the back windowsill of the car being driven away, hammering on the window. I now know what he was going back to. He was hammering on the window and nobody was listening.
Yeah, yeah. And so the letter that he wrote, I'm going to jog your memory here, but my recollection is that he actually stood up in class and read it out to the class, the whole class, with the teacher. Astonishing thing to me, there's the teacher actually allowed that to happen.
Well, I think she intervened very quickly, in fairness to the teacher. But he was under instruction to do this.
Yeah. And as a result of that, what happened then? Who became involved?
Well, again, I remember this very, very vividly. I was at my accountant's and I received a phone call from social services telling me not to pick up from school. Serious allegations had been made against me, and to expect the police that evening, and to get myself a solicitor. Now, I'm a reasonably robust character, but my legs went to jelly standing in that office. And fortunately, my accountant I've been with him for a long time, and he's a good friend, and he was very supportive, but that was a dreadful moment. Ultimately, the police didn't ever attend my home, and it transpired that there was a history of allegations being made by this particular individual against other men. I do, however, know, and you might recall this, that there was some pressure put on the officer in charge by a more senior officer, saying, just go along and interview this guy because we're getting a lot of grief from the mother.
But it did mark a point in the family proceedings. What happened in terms of your relationship with your son after that?
I didn't see him for 14 months. And because there were residency proceedings in place, I was always inclined to be cooperative with the court, naively, by the way, cooperative. And
I think this was prior to you seeing me, that a period of time when you tried to have contact again with...
Well, I naively imagined that we would roll up at court one day and it would all be resolved.
Yeah.
And I remember eventually engaging you, and you I would say, are a common sense solicitor who is noted, and I now know from other people, for your inclination to collaborate rather than confront unless absolutely necessary. And we attended this particular hearing, and I recall the allegations being detailed, and you said to me at the time that had the judge been smart, he'd have accepted this estrangement for a period, but said to the mother, but these are serious allegations. If you are lying, woe betide you, because the consequences of you lying to me and the court will be significant. And he didn't. I
think I said that to the judge, or invited the judge to adopt that approach to the case at an early stage.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And he didn't. And he proved to be a man who had some astonishing views, ones that I think really changed the case, because at one point he said, I don't know why men don't just concentrate on earning money and leaving women to look after the kids. And I think, Mike, you'd be able to explain better our response to that.
Well, the case went on for quite a long time with my involvement. And you're quite right. My approach generally is to see if we can reach a sensible accommodation between parties, between the advocates and the court. But in this particular case, and I've known the judge many, many years, and I have a very good relationship with him. But in this particular case, at one point, I was so concerned about his approach that I made an application that a member of the press attend, which is very, very rarely happens in family law cases. I advised him that I was instructed to make a formal complaint against him on your instructions. And happily, that ultimately led him to transfer the case to a high court judge. But there were a lot of quite uncomfortable exchanges, the sort of exchanges which you don't normally see between advocates and judges.
Well, because I wouldn't be aware of that, but they were very uncomfortable exchanges. And as the father, it's very difficult to sit there silently and listen to this without being...
And you're not a man who's used to silence. Really,
I'm not, Mike, no. So it's it was very, very challenging, and I felt so helplessly lost and without any power.
Yeah. Now, as well, the judge wasn't the only individual in this case. The judge is assisted usually by other professionals. In your case, Children's Services became involved because sometime down the line, concerns arose about the mother's alcohol use, her mental health, state of mental health, and also in very difficult children cases, the court can appoint an independent social worker called a children's guardian, who were employed by CAFCAS, an agency, state agency, specially set up to provide independent representation for children and advice to the court. Do you feel that you were assisted by those social work professionals?
I only saw gross incompetence and a complete absence of any humanity. And their incompetence, and I emphasise incompetence, could have resulted in the death of my son. The death of my son. They facilitated being driven around the country by a woman who would have been 4, 5, 6 times over the drink drive limit. Worse, 4 neighbours had made written complaints to social services expressing their fear for his welfare.
Were you made aware of those?
No. In fact, they actively hid them from me.
Yeah. Now, we have to say that we're just talking about your case, and this is not a series where we vilify or criticise other professionals. But this is your only case.
You've asked for my personal experience, so I can only speak from my personal experience.
Yeah.
And I'd also talk about a significant level of dishonesty.
Could you explain how you can say that?
Yeah, well, for example, I'm fast forwarding here a little bit, but there was eventually once these 4 letters had been exposed, and I remember the judge being absolutely shocked, particularly the nature of the way they'd been. So significantly, she reserved the case to herself. Yeah. So there's some continuity, because one of my issues was the lack of continuity of seeing different judges.
Yeah.
And so there were these 4 complaints made that we knew nothing of. But you've got to set that in the context where I have highlighted some of the extreme behaviour and my fears for his welfare.
And just on that point, Andy, one of the things that I did when I started off was to gather together all of the information that was available from police records, from court records, from CAFCAS reports, and so on and so forth, and produced a very, very detailed chronology. And if you recall, that chronology highlighted many of these concerns. Were you ever given the opportunity to give your history in those terms to the independent professionals or the social work professionals?
Not at all. I wasn't spoken to.
Did you feel that they wanted to listen to you?
Absolutely not. They didn't want to know. They wanted the case closed as quickly as possible, with residency passed to the mother, and with contact twice a year via a birthday and Christmas card. Bear in mind that they should have recognised, at least identified this as a potential problem when she was arrested for drink driving 4 times over the drink drive limit. But that was again dismissed.
And why do you think they had they gave you such short shrift?
I think that the mother would have presented as being vulnerable. I think she was later on described by the second judge as highly manipulative. So that was the case. I don't doubt that. Nevertheless, she's not unique in being of that character. So I'd have anticipated more inquiring minds. And ultimately, there are physical tests to identify the levels of alcohol that you're consuming.
Yeah.
And so I started to describe the complaints from neighbours. And this particular complaint was responded to by a social worker who wrote, "Dear, please don't be concerned, but there's been a complaint from a neighbour about X, Y and Z." And the second judge asked the social worker, why did you address hers? Because you don't know this individual. And she said, well, I rang her and she said it was an ex-partner who was just who'd been banned by the court from seeing his son and was trying to stir up trouble. The fact of the matter was, we were caught up in the lengthy delays that come with a residency application.
Yeah. But
there were no further inquiries made by that social worker, or inquiries made of the other 3 complaints that were made. Ultimately, one of those complainants was summoned to court because she was a friend of the mother's who felt she was acting in best interests, but didn't clearly want to face the prospect of standing in court, and ultimately she did do.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the circumstances of that particular individual, that she had gone for a camping weekend with her child, together with your son and his mum, and she was so concerned about what had happened over that weekend that she rang the NSPCC and made a report, and that report was then conveyed to Children's Services. Did Children's Services tell you about that incident?
No.
And was that made available voluntarily to the court?
It was hidden from the court. So when I used the word dishonesty before, and as you said, we're not here to tarnish all professionals with the same brush, but from my experience, it was a culture of dishonesty.
And how did you become aware of this particular incident?
I think it was via an application that you made for disclosure of documents.
Yeah. And so you went 14 months without seeing your son at all. How old was he at that point? Do you remember?
He'd have been nearly 6.
Yeah.
And
prior to that, what had your relationship been like?
Very, very close. Unusually close, I think you'd describe. He was a budding footballer. So we shared lots of time together. And I feel emotional now when I even start to recall it. So eventually you secured an order where I could go to watch him play football, and his mother wouldn't be in attendance because it was felt that she would be a distraction, correctly felt. I can remember this particular game, and I turned up there, and of course her mother had scant regard for any court order, and the court had little appetite for enforcing any orders, so they were worthlessly made. but I attended this particular game, and I stood behind the goal, and I recall Rachel being there with a friend, and her friend, the ball went behind the goal, and her friend shouted out, "Don't worry, he won't hurt you, we're here."
Mm-hmm.
The sort of very manipulative conduct that ultimately was exposed in the court. So I told him how much I loved him, walked away, didn't watch the end of the game, and didn't see him for 14 months.
Yeah.
By which time we now know he'd been physically and mentally abused.
Mm.
And those responsible for that abuse are the social workers, the guardian that was ultimately appointed, and in my mind, they would say the court system. I would disagree with that, and I would say a more proactive judge would have expedited matters in the interest of the child, not in the interest of parents, but in the interest of getting it right with the child. There were so many alarm bells that were ringing that it's mind-boggling to a lay person that the court could be so inactive.
Yeah. You've explained the nightmare that you fell into. Things gradually developed and then very suddenly changed. Can you recall what happened?
Again, very clearly, I received a phone call on a Friday afternoon from you. And you may recall you'd actually been helping me fund the ongoing proceedings because I was out of cash. I'd spent every penny that I had, and I was paying you on the drip, and you were working in lunchtimes for me.
It's a good job. I've retired from the partnership, and none of my ex-partners will hear this bit, Andy. But...
Well, you got paid in full in the end.
Yeah.
But there was a period where I struggled. I didn't, I was a PAYE salary earning employee, and it was the costs are I'm not saying your costs were unreasonable, but because of the multiple hearings that you have to attend, the direction hearings. So I received a phone call, and you said you need to be in court on Monday morning, and I can't tell you why.
Yeah.
But just before I reflect on what happened there, I want to emphasise my passion is not about retribution on social workers or the system. My preference and my frustration is that the lack of research that's done on the outcomes from these proceedings, because the only way we learn and improve is by identifying whether we've been successful or not. But I will go back,
and we'll come back to that.
So I attended court on the Monday, and it emerged that was going to be removed from his mother's care under an order after tests by a psychologist had...
Well, I think just to clarify, the psychologist who'd undertaken assessment of all of you, you, the mother, had reached certain interim conclusions, but was so concerned for welfare that she contacted the child solicitor to say, in my opinion, should be removed immediately from his mother. Not my conclusions cannot be made available to the parents because I'm concerned that if the mother were to know, would be in immediate danger of significant harm. I want the case before the judge Monday morning, only the judge to have sight of my report, and then at that point an application was made, but the judge didn't need any convincing about what should happen.
The question I would ask you, Mike, is how often does that circumstance arise?
There is only one other case that I've had where that was the recommendation of the court.
So the serious nature of it is in itself evidenced by that.
It's infinitesimally smaller number of times that's happened.
And do you recall the options that were on the table for where would would go to.
Well, I do very, very much that the options were very limited because his contact with you had been restricted so much.
More that there'd been an active campaign through those 14
Yes,
months.
I was hesitating to use the words that his mind had been poisoned, but his mind had been poisoned against you. And so the options then were that he moved into local authority foster care because the local authority were involved at that stage. But fortunately, one of your family hadn't been tarnished in the same way, and that was your brother-in-law, your sister's husband. And so arrangements were made for him to move to their home, which is what happened.
That's correct.
And that was an interim arrangement until your relationship could be re-established.
Yeah. The depth of, you described poisoning his mind. I remember the psychologist saying he'd suffered from a condition called splitting.
Yeah.
So when a child's experience, and this is very much a layman's take on it, when a child's experience of one parent is so significantly different to the narrative that person is hearing from the other parent, they can't cope at 6 or 7 years of age with that level of uncertainty. So they fall down on one side. And as an adult, tells me about the level of bribery that was undertaken to persuade him to say certain things, do certain things. But the psychologists ultimately, I recall seeing the first time in 14 months at my sister's house. And I walked into the lounge and he was on a computer game. And I recall he turned around and saw me. And I sat down on the settee and I said to him, "You want to come over for a cuddle?" And he unhesitatingly got up and came over to me. But all the psychological reports would show that even months after we'd been reintegrated, he still had a warped perspective on where they had a bag with balls in it with emotions on it. Yeah. And initially it was totally unequivocally positive about his mother and unequivocally negative about me. Even a year later, that hadn't changed spectacularly. He had, and yet his behaviour would suggest completely the opposite, in that he was by then living with me. But he was very substantially, very, very substantially damaged mentally. He was abused physically, but I think it's the mental damage that is by far the more significant and ongoing result of the failings of social services and the courts. I'm reluctant to blame his mother because she herself was someone who was suffering from multiple underlying personality disorders, chronic alcoholism, and couldn't look after herself. She needed protecting from herself by social services and the courts.
And if the correct assessments had been done at the earliest possible opportunity, this would have come out.
It could have come out in hours, not days, not weeks, certainly not months or years. And the blindness of social services, and frankly, in the instance of a judge, and I know you don't want to be critical of a judge, but his absolute refusal to countenance any prospect that what I was saying was true. When
Just going back to they got. We arrived at a point when the first judge gave you a very clear indication of his thinking. Can you recall that part of the proceedings?
A devastating blow in my life, and I'm ashamed to talk about it. But he had, at one point, had said to me, listen, I don't know why you don't just concentrate on earning money and leave looking after your son to the woman. And I realised at that point he had a particularly fixed mindset. And I was never ever going to win his favour. And it was put to me that it would be maybe in best interests if I didn't see him again until he was 18, and that I should send him a card on his birthday and at Christmas, and then resurrect the relationship when I was 18. And I succumbed to the pressure from the court to do this, and within minutes, not hours, I was signing documents to say that I wouldn't see him, and I'd agreed to these two. I was a broken man by this point who lost the capacity to think, and I had a social workers and a judge who were desperate to see me out of my son's life.
That's how it felt to you.
No, it's how it was.
Yeah.
It's not how it felt to me, it's how it was. Bear in mind, I have an extended family. I have a mother who is described in a note that he read out in the class as an alcoholic who lay drunk on the floor from drinking whiskey. She's a primary school teacher.
Yeah.
And you met her during the course of proceedings.
I was very fortunate to meet her.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
The devastation that she suffered.
Yeah. Well,
when social workers looked at her as though she was an alcoholic who was neglecting her grandson.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know she's passed away now, but she was a wonderful lady.
She was.
Very strong individual as well, but a very lovely, loving mom, and a very proud grandma as well.
She was, but she was broken by the way she was treated.
So there came a point then when you decided you couldn't carry on.
As I've just described. And I'd always, I hope, because you interrogate yourself, I always hoped that I'd acted with integrity and wasn't looking at my own self-interest or that of my family. And I reached a point, well, maybe if this is the collective view of social services and the guardian, a guardian who I now know would go around for afternoon tea with the mother,
yeah,
and have cakes,
yeah,
that she'd send him home with. And I realised that I didn't realise that I was so, my head was so mashed that I thought, if this is the advice that all these professionals are giving me, that it's in best interests, maybe I'm left with no other alternative, and maybe I am wrong. Because my thinking became confused.
Yeah. How long did that last?
24 hours. And a conversation with you. And you explain what happened next.
Well, I remember very well you telling me that you couldn't see any point in carrying on. And of course, from my point of view, my starting point is always to ask the client what their ideal outcome is, what they want. I knew what your ideal outcome was, that you wanted to be in life to share the parenting care of him. But at the same time, it wasn't my case, it wasn't me, and I had to respect the point that you'd reached. But it was one of those rare sleepless nights for me, because I'm usually able to hit the pillow and go to sleep. And I did spend a troubled night with this going round and round in my head. And so the next morning, I rang you and said, Andy, I don't feel comfortable about this. I think we can get somewhere here. I know it's difficult, but I just don't think in this particular case you should give up. And yeah, that's what I said. And I don't think I've ever had that conversation before or since.
And without that conversation, who knows what would have happened?
Yeah.
And
I'll tell you that I shared your sense of injustice, and I also shared the sense of isolation, because everyone else in the case seemed convinced that in some way or other you were a villain, and that your son would be better off not seeing you. And I'd spent a lot of time with you. I'd also researched the factual background of the case, and I tried to lay that out for the court, for the other professionals, for the solicitor, because he had his own solicitor, and to say, look, the facts speak for themselves. If you look closely enough, you will see that there's a pattern of behaviour by the mother, that behaviour is commented upon in records when the police have been called round to see her, and they've made notes for themselves to indicate they don't believe what she's saying. And if you used your imagination, just read between the lines of this case, you would see what was going on. And I tried throughout my involvement to spell that out. I'd felt very, very frustrated, but also determined that justice should happen here.
And all your actions were highly laudable, and without you, I wouldn't be sitting where he is today, and I wouldn't be. But it's wrong that we depend on a solicitor, a particularly accomplished, determined man of integrity, recognised, I understand, by other solicitors as being a magnet of integrity. In fact, they almost thought you were out on a limb, that you were representing this character who is so hell-bent on securing access to his son. But, even after the case, the behaviour continued, because this particular individual was working as a classroom assistant. So she has been exposed in court as having a chronic alcohol issue, multiple underlying personality disorders, and the extreme step has been taken to remove her child from her care.
You're talking about the mother in
this.
Yeah.
Yet she has persuaded the head teacher of the school where she's working that it's all a tissue of lies, will be resolved very quickly, and that she was more than capable of carrying on looking after a special needs child. So she's had her own child removed. She carries on looking after a special needs child until she gets drunk as a skunk and abuses this poor boy and is summarily dismissed.
Yeah.
The reaction, sorry to carry on, Mike, the reaction in any other environment would have been, we need to investigate, how have we allowed this to happen? That wasn't the nature of the inquiry. The nature of the inquiry, as you'll recall, we discovered, was that they had employed an independent media advisor to assess the likely profile that the case would enjoy in a tabloid newspaper, were I to be an individual that would choose to disclose this.
Yeah.
Now,
I think this was an incident which occurred towards the end of the proceedings.
Well, it was after it had been removed.
After he'd been removed, but we were still in court.
That's right, yeah.
And the mother was still even though Jack had been removed, she was still working in the school as a classroom assistant, and she was eventually only dismissed because she became hopelessly drunk at a staff Christmas party and then made abusive remarks about the child who she was meant to be looking after, in the presence of his mother, who was a dinner lady at the school. I mean, a shocking incident, but one which you would have expected to be reported immediately to the court and the parties. But as you say, it was hidden from us. So again, quite a dreadful example.
My experience, and again, it's my very personal experience, so this isn't a question of fact, but in my experience, social services spent more time minding their own backs than they did investigating how could they get this matter so wrong, where a child could have been, as I said, killed.
Yeah. Now, Andy, after was removed from his mum and then initially placed with your sister and brother-in-law, what sort of contact did he have with his mum?
So he had, under very, very strict direction, as you may recall, he had contact with her at a contact centre, which I have to say is a pretty grim environment. And again, I look back and think, was that healthy for anybody? For his mother, a disturbing environment. Just on a very, again, I'll give you an example. He was taken to the contact centre, and I had to drop him off and leave him there. And he went to the loo, and then he was brought in to see his mother, and he was obsessing about the smell coming from the toilets. And the social worker said, well, don't worry about that, you just stay with your mother. And he was so insistent that they went to the toilets, where he had wrapped his own excrement in his school sweatshirt and pushed it behind a pipe in the toilets. Now, I can't tell you why he did that, but it's a definite indicator. It should be an alarm bell that there's major worries here.
Yeah.
Despite the judge's really strict directions, his mother was regularly left alone with him, as borne witness by various people. And she couldn't have been more strict in hauling all the people into court and saying, this is a highly manipulative, dangerous woman, you must adhere to my instructions. Well, they didn't, and they befriended her. And again, the damage continued.
I know this is emotional. It's emotional for me, if I'm honest. One of the privileges of this sort of discussion is that very rarely do we as solicitors get the opportunity to speak to our clients after a case is finished, and certainly not in this sort of depth. We move on from one case to the next. So it's fascinating to hear about the impact that being involved in the family justice system has had on you and also on your son. So you described how your son went from a position of not seeing you for 14 months to then starting to see you again, but only after he'd moved to his aunt and uncles, and then moving back to you. And then he only saw his mum under strict supervision. Now, I know that in a very short period of time, his contact with his mum finished completely in rather dramatic circumstances. Can you just explain how that happened? Not in too much detail, because I also want us to have some time for you to reflect on some wider consequences of your involvement and some messages that you've got for professionals involved and also for people who may find themselves in your situation.
It's very sad that his relationship with his mother ended in some fairly dramatic circumstances, but she had promised him that she would stop drinking. And when you're a young boy, you don't understand what a big challenge that is.
Yeah.
And he found her stash of vodka and was angry, frustrated, upset, and made a decision that he didn't want to continue going to see her while she was in that state. Very, very sad. And he probably hasn't seen her for 10 years. And I have regularly during that period asked him whether he's heard from her, and I've probably suggested to him that he should contact her, partly because I think he psychologically needed some closure, some understanding. She did make a couple of attempts to contact him on social media, and he knocked those efforts back. Very tragically, she has been recently found dead in her home in France, and suffering a chronic alcoholism.
Yeah. And I know, because you've told me, that you've been with your son to collect her possessions from...
Well, it was a harrowing experience for him, because such was the level of her conduct that she was estranged from both her mother and her two brothers. She has a half brother and a full brother, and her entire life has been characterised by extreme behaviour. And during lockdown, my son reached out to someone he believed to be his cousin, so his mother's brother's daughter, who's an accomplished runner, and he was disappointed that he got no response. We now know he got no response because her brother had chosen not to tell his children that he had a sister. Such was the damage that she'd inflicted on him and his family.
Yeah.
But my son received a social media message in January saying, could he provide her father with my phone details? And my son immediately said, she's dead. And I said, don't be dramatic. Anyway, it transpired that was the case. And we'd seen pictures of her in social media since. And I simply didn't understand how alcohol could ravage somebody physically in the way that we've seen. Yeah. So we organised a cremation in France, and it was important to me that the person who decided exactly what format that was going to take. And we there were 4 people, the 2 brothers, plus a lady that used to cut the expat's hair at the funeral, because the very tragic part of this story is that his mother's husband died only a matter of weeks previously, but also from chronic alcoholism. And as wealthy expats, they drunk themselves into oblivion is the bottom line. But we organised the cremation, and we've recently had to remove all her personal effects from the house, which is very emotional because, as I said to him at the cremation, she did love him, and we found pictures of her breastfeeding him, and through no fault of his, she was unable to evidence that love in a positive way.
Andy, do you think you'd be able to describe the impact that the proceedings and everything around them has had on your son?
Life-changing. He has suffered some significant challenges through his, particularly his teenage years, and he would acknowledge himself behavioural challenges.
Yeah.
And he has been, he's a bright boy, an accomplished athlete, and his mood and mindset have been the source of constant reflection within school and within sports organisations he's been involved in. So he's had lots of help.
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you now, so have I.
Yeah. Well, that was my next question. You've continued to forge a successful professional career. You've reinvented yourself on a number of occasions, and that takes a lot of determination, grit, and courage. But how has this affected you?
Well, first of all, not as much as grit and courage as it's taken to get from where he was to where he is.
Yeah.
But we've had, obviously, his mother passing was desperately sad. However, in some respects, there's now an opportunity for closure, for him and for me.
Yeah.
And
one of the things that always struck me, Andy, is that throughout all of the conflict, you continued to, and this was both whilst you weren't seeing your son and afterwards, you continued to shoulder a degree of responsibility for his mother.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Last week we travelled to France, where we had the deeply challenging experience of removing all her personal effects from her home. And she had been alone, dead probably for a couple of days before she was found. So, the bodily fluids, we found ourselves having to clean this, remove excrement, and then go through personal effects which was positive again in many respects. We found pictures that she kept of her breastfeeding him, and I was able to reiterate how much she loved him when he was a baby. And so he now has, in some respects, a much easier story to tell, in that Mother's Day, for example, was always a challenging day.
Yeah.
Now, he jokes with me, and has dark humour that sometimes gets people through these situations, that, both of us now had no mother.
Yeah.
In that my mother passed away, who he's very close to.
Yeah. Just moving on now to a different area. What message would you like to give to the lawyers, judges, other professionals about what it's like to be in the middle of family proceedings as a layperson?
Well, I've given messages to couples who've been in conflict about the lasting damage that they do for their child, and implore them to set aside personal angst, disagreements, because there is very, very, very real damage done to kids. At that age, kids are like sponges in terms of their personal development, and they absorb behaviour patterns. And so my message would be the same to those involved in social services and in the justice system. Rather than, and lots of lip service was paid, in my mind, to the system being designed to avoid being adversarial. My experience was it was entirely adversarial. And I think the expense as well that is used on family cases when matters could be with a modicum of intelligence from judges, some fairly basic human qualities were lacking in my experience, and an absence of any sort of intellectual curiosity. There were processes that were being followed irrespective of whether they were going to be damaging to all parties. And I can't speak for every case, and I can only speak from my experience, but my experience was where individuals were more concerned about their own personal career than they were about, in this case, a child.
Yeah.
I strongly feel that my son's mother was spectacularly let down. She needed saving from herself. Had this been dealt with early on in a more collaborative manner, she would have had a relationship with her son.
Yeah.
She'd have been given the support mechanism that she needed to function in life.
Yeah.
And that would clearly have been better for all parties. But there was no attempt to do that. And one of the things that people should be aware of, you are put in an environment where your son is removed under these extreme circumstances and passed to initially to my sister and her husband to live with, and then ultimately to me. But there is no follow-up from social services, no inquiries as to whether there can be any assistance for you, no quantifying the success or otherwise of the decision of the court.
Yeah. What sometimes strikes me is that, and it's not an easy role to be a judge, but they deal with hundreds, if not thousands, of cases, but there's no mechanism for them to invite the parties, not the lawyers, not the professionals, but invite the parties to come and see them, maybe 6 months, 12 months down the line, to see what the impact of their decision has been. Would you have welcomed that opportunity?
Very, very much so. Not just for me, but for all the other cases that are going on. My frustration is that I see it among friends, acquaintances, where they're doing the same damage, sometimes inadvertently, not to the extreme levels that we saw here.
Yeah.
But parents at war and putting their children in the middle of that war cannot start to imagine the damage they are doing. And if they spoke to someone like me, courts spoke to people like me, they would have a real life understanding of the impact of their negligence, their disinterest, their lack of curiosity. In my experience, facts were completely ignored.
Yeah.
Repeatedly ignored.
Yeah. Just pulling the threads together, bringing things to a conclusion, there is a happy ending to your story because your son is now thriving. He's paid to be a sportsman. And I understand that having spent his entire life being looked after and paid for by you, he's arranged something special for you now.
He has, and again, I risk getting very emotional here, but he's always known that my dream was to go to India and tour India, but also watch cricket there. We have a shared passion for sport. So it's my 60th birthday recently, and
Congratulations, Andy.
oh no, congratulations when you're 60, Mike. But I heard him crashing around in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, thinking, what on earth is he doing? And then I heard a whisk going, so I thought, that's nice, he's making me birthday cake, which of course was lovely for him to do in itself.
Yeah.
But the following day, we were all heading off to a big family meal in a restaurant, and I saw that he was sneaking this cake out with him. So I wasn't entirely surprised when he unveiled it at the dinner table. But what I didn't realise was he'd made it in the flag of India. Then handed me his phone, and he'd booked 2 flights to India and tickets for the IPL cricket. So we're going on May the 4th.
Take your time.
For a couple of weeks. And to me it marks almost the end of his difficult childhood stroke teenage years. And I'm proud of him.
Yeah. Well, I think that you're justifiably proud of him, but it's really a mark of how proud he is of you, because when he needed it, you fought for him, and you have each other, and you're going to be able to have the most amazing time together.
We're going to have a great time. He's got a fabulous girlfriend, very smart girl, and they've got plans to buy an apartment this summer.
Yeah.
And this trip rounds off almost a passage of the end of one era and a positive new world for him.
Yeah. Andy, thank you so much for joining me in opening the door to family law. I hope that people will find this useful as a way of seeing what the experience can be like. I hope people will listen and that it will start a debate about how we can improve on the system, because it's a system which is there for all of us. It's not owned by the state. It's not owned by the judges or the lawyers or the social workers. It's not owned by the parents or the children. It's a system which is there to bring justice, fairness, and resolution to those disputes that people can't sort out themselves. And the system needs to listen to those who are involved in it. And as you said, in other environments, people listen and continuously learn. And I think that that's a message which we should be giving out to family justice.
Very much so. In sport, for example, there's been a big body of research that's secured quite a lot of publicity around the effects of heading footballs. And the evidence that we've discovered is that players are suffering an enhanced rate of Alzheimer's because of that activity. Why is there no academic research around outcomes from family dispute cases?
Yeah.
Not just on the child. The child's clearly the primary, but these things impact on sisters, brothers, grandmothers, mothers.
Yeah.
And yet there isn't research to quantify the success of decisions made in the family system.
Thanks again, Andy. It's been great to see you. Great to spend time with you. I really
owe you a lot,
appreciate it.
Mike.